PowerPoint going? There we go. Sorry about that. I'm Sean Faircloth. I'm the Director of Strategy and Policy for the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science U.S. And if you believe in the separation of church and state and the acceptance and inclusion of non-theistic Americans, then you're my boss, and I work for you. Richard Dawkins asked me to work on your behalf for political strategy and framing in Washington, D.C., and organizing for secular advocacy in every single state of the Union, including in the state of California. That's what we're going to advocate regarding. And we need it because we have a lot to learn in Washington. There's a lot of issues that need to be settled, but there are some issues that have been settled quite clearly. For example, there was a recent hearing of the United States Congress on the issue of global warming, where they were talking about concerns regarding the seas rising. And Congressman John Shimkus settled the matter for us because he pointed out on the public record that in the Bible it says one flood, Noah's flood, that's it, so you don't need to worry about those seas rising. Thank you, Congressman Shimkus. Don't you all feel relieved? We're settling that matter for you? Because politics has changed a lot in this country. You know, Republican Dwight Eisenhower was the first to institute a national science advisory team. President Kennedy expanded support for science. Mid-20th century America had a far different and far more bipartisan attitude towards science than prevails in America today. Perhaps a person who most embodied the mid-20th century spirit of science in American public policy was a Californian who few people even remember today. He was Congressman George Brown. He was a quiet, hard-working member of Congress. He was unusual for a politician. He was an engineer by training. In 1978, Brown initiated the first federal climate change research program, and back in 1972, initiated the Office of Technology Assessment. Now, the Office of Technology Assessment was the envy of other advanced nations who praised its objectivity and its technical and scientific integrity and expertise. Republican Congressman Amo Hooten praised the Office of Technology Assessment as producing 750 objective analytical studies at low cost. And this Republican congressman declared that eliminating this program would be, in his words, dumb. But the program was eliminated by a now former member of Congress who recently called for a permanent moon base by the year 2020. You may be familiar with this former member of Congress, who was often prone to making dramatic suggestions, but dramatic suggestions unvetted by scientists. Newt Gingrich led elimination of the Office of Technology Assessment when he assumed the speakership back in 1995. The last head of the Office of Technology Assessment was a Republican. This Republican scientist commented about Speaker Gingrich that some concluded Gingrich, quote, didn't want an internal congressional voice that had views on science and technology that might be different from his. Thus arose the expert for hire culture that we see so much of in American politics today, the type of culture in which any unsubstantiated claim is given equal weight with scientific evidence. For instance, the National Cancer Institute had a fact sheet affirming the scientific reality that abortion is not connected to breast cancer, and yet Congressman Chris Smith organized successfully during the Bush years to remove this fact sheet. And this was an action based on political pressure, not based upon science. And with the elimination of the Office of Technology Assessment, it became much easier for irrational ideas to trump science and reason, which is the mission of the Richard Dawkins Foundation. Scientific objectivity is not some mere abstraction. It is something that affects real people's lives. Do you ever know someone who's faced leukemia or had a family member who did. About 250,000 children and adults develop some form of leukemia every year, and most die from it. But there's hope. Specifically because of embryonic stem cell research, they may develop a special type of white blood cell that destroys leukemia cancer cells. Do you ever know someone who's faced diabetes? Millions face this horrible disease, often resulting in amputation, horrible disability, and later death. But there's hope. Because of embryonic stem cell research, there is specific hope for development of stem cells that produce insulin-treating type 1 diabetes. This can help many lives, but yet the religious right seems to think that they can impose their view of biblical law on the rest of us in American law in a way that can impede the extension of life for our fellow citizens. Maybe you know of someone who's faced Lou Gehrig's disease, or maybe you know of someone who suffered a stroke, or Parkinson's disease, or spinal cord injury. But religious extremists are trying to block research that could save millions of lives. In addition to numerous state laws today which impede stem cell research, there is now a federal law on the books that's been on the books for a number of years that, unless there's a court ruling in favor of health, could mean dashing the hopes of millions with regard to embryonic stem cell research. This is not a time to drag our feet. This is a time for a space program effort in terms of scientific research, in embryonic stem cell research, and a whole host of other areas of which this is just one example. It is true that politics has changed in this nation. It is true that challenging this trend will require courage. But it was Barry Goldwater, who I quote so often in my book, Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative, who said, and I quote, "I have no respect for the religious right." Barry Goldwater, who would have difficulty even running for a Republican nomination for Congress today, much less for the Republican nomination for presidency in the United States today. Our nation was long committed to a higher set of ideals, embodied by the words of a scientist named Thomas Jefferson, who said, and I quote, "The main object of all science, the freedom and happiness of man, are the sole objects of legitimate government." We need those who will strive for our nation's highest ideals. And I ask the young people in this room to challenge yourselves, to consider a career in science, yes, but also for there to be young people in this room who will consider becoming involved in American public life, who will run for office yourself and be an advocate for science like George Brown was, to support the high ideals of people like Thomas Jefferson. That is what the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science U.S. does. We speak out. We organize in every state, including in the state of California, to the ideals of people like Jefferson and Madison and the Enlightenment. And one person who truly embodies those ideals, which go beyond the borders of the United States, is a man who is a member of the Royal Society, the most prestigious scientific institution in Britain, a member of the Royal Society of Literature, the most prestigious literary organization in Britain, because Richard Dawkins is our prose poet of science, and we serve that mission in our foundation, and we serve those Jeffersonian ideals because science and the truth is inspiring. And I now will turn it over to Professor Stephen Gawlin to formally introduce Professor Richard Dawkins.
I trust you're all as eager as I am to learn about Darwin's 5 ridges. Please join me in enthusiastically welcoming our distinguished speaker, Professor Richard Dawkins.
The philosopher Daniel Dennett said that if he had to give a prize for the greatest idea that anybody ever had, he would give it to Charles Darwin, ahead of Newton and Einstein and everybody else. That might be a slight exaggeration, but I would agree that Darwin was probably the most revolutionary scientist ever, in the sense of the one who initiated the most seismic overturning of pre-existing ideas. Before Darwin, it took a philosopher of the caliber of David Hume to rumble the illogic of, if a thing looks designed, it must have been designed. Even Hume, though he could see that the argument to design is a bad argument, an illogical argument, he couldn't think of a better alternative. Darwin provided the alternative, and how Hume would have relished the "I told you so" moment that Darwin handed him if only he'd lived to see it. The argument to design was familiar to Darwin, for whose cohort of Cambridge undergraduates William Paley was compulsory reading. If it looks designed, it was designed, and the more designed it looks, the stronger the argument. Paley, author of Natural Theology, imagined crossing a heath, stubbing his foot on a watch lying on the ground. Open it up, and you see complicated cogs and springs, obviously all geared to the useful task of telling the time. How much more dramatically would you note the same thing if you saw an eye or a knee joint or a heart? Both of them appear to need a design. The watch definitely has a design, the watchmaker, the eye or the heart or the kidney. Well, that was Paley's argument, he thought it did too. Both Paley's watch and the vertebrate eye, for example, are statistically improbable in that if you take their parts and scramble them into a random combination 1,000,000 times, not once will you hit upon a combination that tells the time or that sees in full colour stereoscopically with instantaneous light metering and so on. Statistically improbable we have to add in a previously specified direction, because with hindsight every random combination, every heap of junk is as improbable as any other. How astounding it is that of all the blades of grass on the golf course, the ball landed on this particular blade and no other. The point about a hole-in-one in golf is that the hole is specified in advance. If you specified any particular blade of grass in advance, then when the ball landed on it would be just as remarkable as a hole-in-one. Actually more so, because the hole is larger than a blade of grass. The watches and eyes have their functions, telling the time and seeing, respectively, specified in advance, and both are functions that are difficult to achieve. So a random scrambling of parts is very unlikely to achieve either function with any efficiency. Before Darwin came along, the only alternative to random chance was design. Everybody can see intuitively the force of the argument that Paley generalized from watch to eye to every other part of every living body. There must have been a designer. And yet, intuition was wrong. It is the unholy juxtaposition of commonsensically true with now known to be false that singles out Darwin's great idea as deeply seditious. The key to Darwin's idea is, of course, cumulative natural selection. Provided that a smoothly cumulative gradient of improvement exists, that's not a difficult condition to realize, natural selection will find it and will propel evolution up the slopes of what I've called Mount Improbable to limitless, it would seem, limitless heights of perfection. But if you overlooked the smooth cumulative gradient, you would think it was too improbable to countenance. Think about making an eye in a single step of chance. It cannot be done. But if you make an eye from a slightly different eye, which is made from a slightly different eye, and so on, back and back and back through ever simpler eyes, it's very easy. That's over and over again in the animal kingdom. But this great idea, this seditious, revolutionary, deeply surprising idea, eluded every great philosopher and scientist before the 19th century. It was an idea that came late, independently, into the prepared minds of at least two naturalists in the 19th century, Darwin himself and Alfred Russel Wallace. It was they alone who, I'm going to develop the argument, it was they alone who really saw the key to understanding how to explain that illusion of design that, in Hume's words, ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. Well, I singled out Darwin and Wallace, but claims of priority have been made on behalf of at least two other 19th century writers, and I'm going to talk about them under the heading of Darwin's 5 bridges. Patrick Matthew was one, and Edward Blythe the other. Edward Blythe, 1810 to 1873, was Darwin's almost exact contemporary. Like Darwin and Wallace, he was a naturalist and a collector of specimens in the tropics, in his case India. He really did hit upon the idea of natural selection and published it in 1835. But his version is only what we would call today stabilizing selection. That is, natural selection preserving the original type, not natural selection driving evolution into ever newer types. And it's no wonder then that he was a staunch creationist. He was not an evolutionist at all. He thought of natural selection as a negative force, removing deformities, preserving God's original creations in their pristine state. He was very opposite of an evolutionist. Patrick Matthew, 1790 to 1874, was different. He used his experience of growing trees, with apple and pear trees in his Scottish orchard, to write a book in 1831 on naval timber and arboriculture. And in an appendix to this work, Matthew recognized the principles of artificial selection, artificial breeding, which he advocated for growing good quality timber for the Navy, could be generalized to natural selection. Unlike Blythe, Matthew did not see natural selection as a purely negative force, a purely stabilizing force, preserving the original form of the created species. Matthew even went so far as to speculate that the progeny of the same parents under great differences of circumstance might in several generations even become distinct species incapable of co-reproduction. When The Origin of Species was first published, Matthew protested at Darwin's failure to cite him, and Darwin punctiliously did so in later editions of his book. Matthew, he said, clearly saw the full force of the principle of natural selection. But did he? I'm left wondering. Did Matthew really grasp the immense power of the discovery that he'd made? Did he appreciate that natural selection is the answer to the great riddle of existence and the illusion of design? Did he see it as the explanation for all of life, the destroyer of Paley's theology, the destroyer of the argument from design? If he had got the point, wouldn't he have published it in a more prominent place than the appendix to a manual on naval timber? Wouldn't he have trumpeted it from the rooftops as the most important idea anyone ever had? On the contrary, Matthew seems to have found the idea so obvious, almost trivial, as to need no discovery. In a letter to the Gardener's Chronicle of the 12th of May 1860, he wrote, "To me the conception of this law of nature came intuitively, as a self-evident fact, almost without an effort of concentrated thought. Mr. Darwin here seems to have more merit in the discovery than I have had. To me it did not appear a discovery. He seems to have worked it out by inductive reason, slowly and with due caution, to have made his way synthetically from fact to fact onwards. While with me it was by a general glance at the scheme of nature that I estimated this select production of species as an a priori recognizable fact, an axiom requiring only to be pointed out to be admitted by unprejudiced minds of sufficient grasp." Well, with hindsight, I'm sympathetic to Matthew, who felt that his priority had been stolen. But whereas Huxley, T.H. Huxley, on closing The Origin, said, "How extremely stupid of me not to have thought of that," Matthew's response seems to be the Victorian equivalent of big deal, so what else is new? Is this the response of a man who, 7 years before Darwin and 27 before Wallace, found himself in possession of the central unifying idea that dominates all biology, explains everything about life, including human life, the greatest idea anyone ever had? As a, I think, fair parallel, imagine that the thought experiment, a 17th century ancestor of Patrick Matthew, saw an apple fall perhaps in the very same orchard that the Matthews had been farming that orchard since the 16th century. Our earlier Matthew, I imagine, to have been a physicist, and as he watched his apple fall, he conjectured that the earth exerted an attractive force on apples, pulling them towards it. Now, if this hypothetical horticulturalist had later written to Isaac Newton and indignantly claimed priority to the theory of gravitation, Newton, who was, by the way, a less generous man than Darwin, would rightly have given him short shrift. My hypothetical physicist Matthew, let's suppose, confined his theory to apples, or at best to objects falling towards the earth. He lacked Newton's grand vision of the same force acting throughout the universe, responsible for the elliptical orbits of the planets, for the stars in their courses, ultimately for the very structure of the universe itself. So I agree with those champions of Patrick Matthew that he's been unkindly treated by history. But I hesitate to assign full priority to him, partly because he wrote in a much more obscure style than either Darwin or Wallace, which makes it hard to know in some places what he was talking about, and Darwin himself noted this. But mostly because he seems to have underestimated, to an extent where we have to doubt whether he really understood how important the idea was. Wallace was different. Although he discovered natural selection later than Patrick Matthew and later than Darwin's unpublished manuscripts, Wallace has a genuine claim to be up there with Darwin and Newton among the immortals. When Wallace hit upon natural selection, he was in no doubt of its immense importance for the whole history of life. The very title of his paper, the one he sent to Darwin, which set the cat among Darwin's pigeons, says it: on the tendency of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. Depart indefinitely. That was the key phrase. If they depart indefinitely from the original type, they can branch and eventually spawn all of life. And Wallace made that explicit in his paper. The drama of how Wallace's letter arrived at Down House, where Darwin lived, on the 17th of June, 1858, casting Darwin into an agony of indecision and worry, is well known, and I won't retell it in detail. In my view, the whole episode is one of the more creditable and agreeable in the history of scientific priority disputes, precisely because it wasn't a priority dispute, although it easily could have become one. It was resolved amicably, with heartwarming generosity on both sides, I think especially Wallace's. In my opinion, the Wallace paper needs to be read in conjunction with his earlier paper in the Annals and Magazine of Natural History. Darwin had read that paper when it came out in 1855, and it led to Wallace joining his large circle of correspondence, and it led to his engaging Wallace's services as a collector of specimens. Wallace was a professional collector, that's how he made his living. But oddly, when Darwin read Wallace's 1855 paper, I should say, he didn't see in that paper any warning that Wallace was about to spook. Wallace was by then a convinced evolutionist of a very Darwinian stamp. I mean, as opposed to, say, a Lamarckian view of evolution, which saw modern species as all on a ladder, changing into one another as they moved up the ladder. Wallace, by contrast, in 1855, had a clear view of evolution as a branching tree, exactly like Darwin's famous diagram, which was the only illustration in The Origin of Species. But the 1855 paper, the one that Darwin read, makes no mention of natural selection or the struggle for existence. That was left to Wallace's 1858 paper, the one that hit Darwin like a lightning bolt. Wallace even used the phrase struggle for existence, and he devoted considerable attention to the exponential increase in numbers, which is another one of Darwin's key points. Wallace said, the greater or less fecundity of an animal is often considered to be one of the chief causes of its abundance or scarcity. But a consideration of the facts will show us that it really has little or nothing to do with the matter. Even the least prolific of animals would increase rapidly if unchecked, whereas it is evident that the animal population of the globe must be stationary, or perhaps decreasing. Darwin had done a similar calculation using elephants as his hypothetical example because they were legendarily slow reproducing. He showed it wouldn't take very long for the entire world to be covered with elephant flesh if there were no restraining factors. Wallace deduced from this that, quote, the numbers that die annually must be immense, and as the individual existence of each animal depends upon itself, those that die must be the weakest. Wallace's peroration could have been Darwin himself writing. The powerful retractile talons of the falcon and the cat tribes have not been produced or increased by the volition of those animals, but among the different varieties which occurred in the earlier and less highly organized forms of these groups, those always survived longest which had the greatest facilities for seizing their prey. Neither did the giraffe acquire its long neck by desiring to reach the foliage of the more lofty shrubs and constantly stretching its neck for the purpose, but because any varieties which occurred among its antitypes with a longer neck than usual at once secured a fresh range of pasture over the same ground as their shorter-necked companions, and on the first scarcity of food were thereby enabled to outlive them. Even the peculiar colours of many animals, especially insects, so closely resembling the soil or the leaves or the trunks on which they habitually reside, are explained on the same principle. For though in the course of ages varieties of many tints may have occurred, yet those races having colours best adapted to concealment from their enemies would inevitably survive the longest. Historians of science have raised the suggestion that Wallace's version of natural selection was not quite so Darwinian as Darwin himself believed and gave Wallace credit for. Wallace persistently used the word variety as the level of entity at which natural selection acts, and I think there were a couple of examples in the passage I just quoted. And also there was an example of Wallace's use of the word race in a similar sense. Some people have suggested that Wallace, unlike Darwin, who clearly saw selection as choosing among individuals, suggested that Wallace was proposing what nearly all modern theorists rightly condemn as group selection. Now that would be true if by varieties or races Wallace meant geographically separated groups of animals, or indeed races in the more usual sense of the word. And at first I wondered myself whether Wallace meant that, but you've only got to read the paper more carefully to see that he didn't. By variety and race, Wallace meant what we would nowadays call genetic type, even what a modern population geneticist might mean by an allele. To Wallace, in this paper, variety meant not a local race of eagles, for example, but that set of individual eagles in a local area, that set of individual eagles whose talons were hereditarily sharper than usual. And if I'm right, it's a similar misunderstanding to the one suffered by Darwin, whose use of the word race in the subtitle of The Origin of Species is sometimes misread as supporting group selection or even racialism. That subtitle, rather alternative title, is The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. Once again, Darwin was not using race to mean that set of individuals who live in a certain area and are genetically different from those who live in a different area. Darwin was using race to mean that set of individuals who share a particular hereditary characteristic, such as sharp talons. If Darwin had meant a local race, geographic local race, then he too would have been guilty of the group selection nonsense. I believe that neither Darwin nor Wallace was. By the same token, I do not believe that Wallace's conception of natural selection was different from Darwin's. I think Wallace and Darwin both got there. As for the calumny that Darwin plagiarized Wallace, that's rubbish. The evidence is very clear that Darwin did think of natural selection, had it fully worked out, before Wallace, although he didn't publish it. We have Darwin's abstract of 1842, his longer essay of 1844, both established his priority very clearly. Why Darwin delayed so long before publishing is one of the great mysteries of the history of science. Some historians have suggested that he was afraid of the religious implications, others the political ones. Perhaps he was afraid of upsetting his devout wife. Maybe he was just a perfectionist, keen to have all his evidence lined up and in place before going public. Or did he just get distracted by his barnacles? You know the story of the barnacles? Darwin's children were taken to see, to visit at the house of some friends. And they were shown all around the house. And then one of Darwin's children said, very puzzled, to one of these other children, "But where does your papa do his barnacles?" When Wallace's letter arrived in Downhouse, Darwin was more surprised than I, at least, I think any non-biologist, think he had any right to be. He wrote to Lyell, his geologist friend, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract of it. Even his terms now stand as heads of my chapters." The coincidence, the resemblance extended to both Darwin and Wallace being inspired by the same man, Robert Malthus, on population. Darwin, by his autobiographical account, was immediately struck by Malthus's emphasis on overpopulation and competition. He wrote, "In October 1838, that is 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on, from long continuous observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favourable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavourable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here then, I had at last got a theory by which to work." Wallace's epiphany, after reading Malthus, took longer to happen, but was more dramatic when it came. It came to his overheated brain in the midst of a malarial fever on the island of Ternate in the Moluccas archipelago. "I was suffering from a sharp attack of intermittent fever, and every day during the cold and succeeding hot fits had to lie down for several hours, during which time I had nothing to do but to think over any subjects then particularly interesting me. One day, something brought to my recollection Malthus's principles of population. I thought of his clear exposition of the positive checks to increase, disease, accidents, war and famine, which keep down the population of savage races to so much lower an average than that of more civilized peoples. It then occurred to me," and Wallace proceeds to his own admirably clear exposition of natural selection as the guiding principle of all life. Now I want to recognize 5 bridges to evolutionary understanding, and I can conveniently illustrate them with, the first 4 of them at least, with our 4 claimants to independent discovery of natural selection. Blythe crossed the first of Darwin's 4 bridges, Matthew the first 2, Wallace the first 3, and Darwin the first 4. And I'll end by adding a 5th bridge, which was not crossed until after Darwin's death. The first of Darwin's bridges is to natural selection as a force for weeding out the unfit. I've used Edward Blythe as my example, the 19th century writer who crossed that bridge. But really the only reason to single out Blythe is that he's been championed, notably by Laura Isley, as a predecessor and even a possible source of Darwin's ideas, which I think is nonsense. As Stephen Gould has argued, the idea of natural selection as a weeder out, a purely negative force, was already widespread. Yes, Blythe had discussed natural selection, but Isley didn't realise, thus committing the usual and fateful error in this common line of argument, that all good biologists did so in the generations before Darwin. Natural selection ranked as a standard item in biological discourse, but with a crucial difference from Darwin's version. The usual interpretation invoked natural selection as part of a larger argument for creating permanency. Natural selection in this negative formulation acted only to preserve the type constant and inviolate by eliminating extreme variance and unfit individuals who threatened to degrade the essence of creative form. And Gould even goes on to quote William Paley himself as setting out his purely negative version of natural selection. Darwin's second bridge is the recognition that natural selection can drive evolutionary change in positive directions. In modern jargon, it's the difference between stabilizing selection and directional selection. Matthew, Wallace, and Darwin all crossed this second bridge. Bridge number 3 leads to the imaginative grasp of the importance of natural selection in explaining all of life in all its richness, and especially to destroying the illusion of design. Wallace and Darwin certainly crossed it. Maybe Matthew did too, but I've given you reasons for doubting that he really developed the full imaginative vision of the constructive power of Darwinism. Darwinism, that was the name that Wallace, in a generous gesture, was later to give it. Bridge number 4 is the bridge to public understanding and appreciation. Darwin crossed it alone in 1859 by writing The Origin of Species. It's a striking fact, noticed by Darwin himself, among others, that when the Darwin-Wallace papers were read the year before, in 1858, to the Linnaean Society, you remember that in 1858, when Wallace's paper arrived, Lyell and Hooker solved the priority problem by engineering it so that Wallace's paper plus 2 papers of Darwin were read aloud together at the Linnaean Society in London in 1858. But when those papers were read in 1858 to the Linnaean Society, nobody took a blind bit of notice, even the professional biologists of that august body. The end-of-year clangor of the hapless president of the Linnaean Society, Thomas Bell, has become notorious and will ring on down the ages. In Bell's review of the Society's transactions at the end of 1858, he said that the year had not been marked by any of those striking discoveries which at once revolutionized the department of science on which they bear. The end of 1859 would have to be reviewed very differently. The Origin of Species struck the Victorian solar plexus like a steam hammer. The world of the mind would never be the same again. Neither science nor anthropology, psychology, sociology, even, and here we come close to the dark side, politics. This book, which Darwin always described as a mere abstract of the great book that he intended to write but never completed, achieved what the 1858 papers did not. It isn't that the Origin explained the theory more clearly than Darwin's and Wallace's brief offerings of 1858. The difference was that a book-length treatment was required to muster all the evidence and lay it out for all to see. And is there a 5th bridge, which Darwin himself never crossed? Inevitably, 150 years later or so, a little bit more, there are several. But the one that I'll single out is the bridge to the so-called neo-Darwinism of the modern synthesis. Neo-Darwinism is a union of Darwinian evolution with Mendelian genetics. I prefer to call it digital Darwinism. It's digital because the essence of Mendelian genetics is digital. Mendelian genes are all or none. They don't blend. Genes are things you can count in a population's gene pool. Evolution consists of changing frequencies of discrete, digital, countable entities, not changing quantities of substances or changing measurements and dimensions. Changing quantities and changing measurements, those all apply at the organism level, the level we call the phenotype, but not at the gene level. What happens in natural selection is that successful genes become more frequent in the gene pool and unsuccessful genes become less frequent. Frequent as in counted. Darwin never crossed the digital bridge. If he had, he would have had a ready answer to Fleming Jenkins, Scottish engineer, who independently of his colleague Lord Kelvin, with whom they collaborated actually on the transatlantic cable, a very different matter, Jenkins gave Darwin a hard time over a matter of theory. He pointed out that on the currently fashionable non-digital blending analog view of heredity, variation would be swamped by successive sexual crossings, and after a few generations would disappear. You can use the analogy of mixing white paint with black paint, pouring them into a vessel together, they'll make grey. And then no matter how many times you mix grey paint with grey paint, you'll never reconstitute the original black and white. And that's exactly what everybody in Victorian times, except Mendel, thought heredity did. And therefore, Jenkins argued, natural selection isn't possible because there would be no variation to work on. Well, as a matter of fact, any fool could have seen that Jenkins' premise was wrong. Variation does not, as a matter of fact, dissolve away as the generations go by. We're not more uniform than our grandparents were, and our grandchildren will retain the same level of variation as we possess. Jenkins thought he was doubting Darwin. Actually, he was doubting observable facts. Nevertheless, his criticism did worry Darwin. The synthesis of Mendelian genetics, digital genetics, with Darwinian evolution was achieved in the 1930s, a little before, mostly by R.A. Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewall Wright, the three great founding fathers of population genetics and of the modern synthesis. They buried Fleming Jenkins. If genes are countable, digital entities that don't blend, their frequencies have no inherent tendency to change. If they do change, then that's evolution. And it happens for a reason. The most interesting reason is non-random natural selection in adaptive directions. But random drift also occurs, to an extent that disputed, and disputed vigorously, bitterly, among the founding fathers of genetics, of population genetics, but now widely accepted among modern molecular geneticists. Random drift, the idea that without selection, evolution will happen anyway in random directions, is especially associated with the third member of the great neo-Darwinian triumvirate, Sewall Wright. Sewall Wright did research on the genetics of guinea pigs, and you see him holding one there on the bench in front of a blackboard covered with mathematical genetic equations. There's a persistent rumour that I can't confirm that immediately after this picture was taken, Wright absent-mindedly picked up the guinea pig and used it to clean off the blackboard. Even those three founding fathers never knew quite how digital genetics really is. In the light of the Watson and Crick revolution, starting in the second half of the 20th century and accelerating ever since, we can now see that the very genes themselves, within themselves, they are digitally encoded messages. Digital in exactly the same sense and in the same way to an astonishing level of detail as computer information as digital is digital. Modern molecular biology is simply a branch of information technology. Of the three founding fathers, I think it was Fisher who, in his 1930 book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, most clearly expressed the evolutionary significance of the abolishing of blending inheritance and substituting Mendelian inheritance. If genes did indeed blend, the variance available for selection would be halved in every generation, just like the grey paint, but Fisher proved it mathematically. Mutation rates would have to be colossal, utterly unrealistic, to maintain the variation necessary for selection. Fisher, right at the beginning of his book, quotes a letter from Darwin to Huxley, probably of 1857, which is before The Origin of Species, which shows how tantalizingly close Darwin himself came to getting Mendelism. One of the great tragedies of the history of science is that Mendel did his work in plenty of time for Darwin to have known about it. But Darwin's German wasn't great, and Mendel's work was not noticed really by anybody until 1900. And so, although the answer to the Fleming-Jenkins criticism was available to Darwin, it was sitting in an obscure German journal, which neither Darwin nor apparently many other people ever opened. Darwin wrote to Huxley I have lately been inclined to speculate, very crudely and indistinctly, that propagation by true fertilization will turn out to be a sort of mixture and not true fusion of two distinct individuals, or rather of innumerable individuals, as each parent has its parents and ancestors. I can understand on no other view the way in which crossed forms go back to so large an extent to ancestral forms. But all this, of course, is infinitely crude. Even Fisher didn't know quite how breathtakingly near Darwin was to discovering Mendelian genetics. He even worked on sweet peas like Mendel. In 1867, Darwin wrote a letter to Wallace that began as follows: "My dear Wallace, I do not think you understand what I mean by the non-blending of certain varieties. It does not refer to fertility. An instance will explain. I crossed the painted lady and purple sweet peas, which are very different coloured varieties, and got, even out of the same pod, both varieties perfect, but none intermediate. Something of this kind, I should think, must occur at first with your butterflies. Though these cases are in appearance so wonderful, I do not know that they are really more so than every female in the world producing distinct male and female offspring." That last sentence is a beautiful example of the power of reason and the importance of seeing through the obvious. When a male mates with a female, you don't get a hermaphrodite. You get either a male or a female, with approximately equal probability. In a way, Mendel never needed to go into his monastery garden and plant his peas. All he had to do was take the inheritance of sex itself and generalize it to all other cases of inheritance. Digital heredity was staring us in the face in the most obvious way you could imagine. The trouble was, it was too obvious to be noticed. Darwin noticed it, and he came close to making the connection. But just as Patrick Matthew didn't quite cross the bridge that Darwin and Wallace crossed, so Darwin didn't quite manage to cross the Mendel-Fisher bridge, at least not decisively enough. Now, I distinguish bridge 1 from bridge 2 as selection versus directional selection, but there's more to it than that. Or perhaps the distinction I'm about to make really separates Matthew's bridge 2 from Darwin and Wallace's bridge 3. I'm talking about, again, the distinction between selection as a negative force and selection as a positive, constructive force that puts together complex new designs. My own preferred way of putting this, the selfish gene way, is to employ digital genes, so perhaps we really have to cross bridge 5 in order to paint the full picture. In modern genetic terms, not Darwin's own terms, natural selection can be defined as the non-random survival of randomly varying coded instructions for how to survive. We see and admire the products, the phenotypes of the good genes. The instructions of DNA, and their most visible products are bodies that survive by doing something impressive, such as flying, swimming, running, digging, or climbing, all in the service of reproduction, which means they also tend to be good at attracting a mate and warding off rivals and rearing children. Now, an important part of the environment that each gene must exploit if it's to ensure its survival in the form of copies of itself is the other genes it encounters in the genomes of a succession of bodies, which, because of sexual reproduction, that means the other genes in the gene pool of the species. As a result, cartels of mutually supportive genes cooperate to build bodies that specialize in some particular method of surviving, whatever it is for the species, grazing or hunting or whatever it is. Different cartels are the gene pools of different species, bound together by the phenomenon of sexual reproduction and separated from all other cartels by the same process, because it's part of the definition of a species that they can't interbreed. Occasionally, often through accidents in geography, gene pools find themselves subdivided, split into two, for long enough to become sexually incompatible, to evolve in different directions to the point where they can no longer interbreed. The subdivisions are then free to go their separate evolutionary ways forever as distinct species. Eventually, separate ways can mean very separate indeed, because animals as different as, say, vertebrates and mollusks originally split apart as members of the same species, different populations of the very same ancestral species. Successive branchings of this kind have given rise to hundreds of millions of species over thousands of millions of years. So at least in sexually reproducing species, evolution consists of changes in gene frequencies in gene pools. And I have to stipulate sexual reproduction because without it we have no clear idea what gene pool even means. Where there is sexual reproduction, the gene pool is the set of available alleles from which the individual members of a species draw their genomes. Draw as in a lottery, the lottery of sex. Each individual genome is like a shuffled pack of cards. The available cards, the cards that are available to be shuffled, are sampled from the gene pool. The statistical frequencies of these available cards change as the generations go by, and that is evolution. We monitor evolution by measuring a sample of the phenotype, the anatomy, physiology, behavior of typical members of the population. As the average phenotype changes, legs get shorter, horns longer, coats shaggier, whatever happens to be evolving at the time, it's tempting to see natural selection as a sculptor's chisel, carving the bones and flesh of the animals themselves. But if we want to talk of chisels, a sharper representation of evolution sees the chisels as working not on the bodies of animals, but on the statistical structure of gene pools. As crests get longer or eyes rounder or tails gaudier, what's really being carved by natural selection is the gene pool. As mutation and sexual recombination enrich the gene pool with fresh variety, the chisels of natural selection carve it into shape. We observe the results in the form of changes in the average phenotype, with phenotypes that serve as the proxies for genes. As the external, visible manifestations of genes, they determine whether those genes are eliminated or whether they persist in the gene pool. The species gene pool is a database which becomes a storehouse of information about the environments of the past, environments in which ancestors survived and passed on the genes that helped them to do so. So to the extent that environments, future environments, resemble those of the past, and mostly they do, the world doesn't just change capriciously, to that extent this, what I call genetic book of the dead, will turn out to be a useful manual for survival in the present and future. The repository of that information at any one time resides in individual bodies, in every cell of those bodies. But in the longer term, where reproduction is sexual and DNA is shuffled from body to body, the database of instructions for survival will be the gene pool of a species. Each individual's genome in any one generation will be a sample from the species database. Different species have different databases because of their different ancestral worlds. Like sand bluffs carved into fantastic shapes by the desert winds, the database in the gene pool of camels will encode information about deserts and how to survive in them. The DNA in mole gene pools will contain instructions and hints for survival in dark, moist soil. The DNA in predator gene pools will increasingly contain information about prey animals, their evasive tricks and how to outsmart them. The DNA in prey gene pools will come to contain information about predators and how to dodge and outrun them. And the DNA in all gene pools contains information about parasites and how to resist their invasions. Natural selection carves and whittles gene pools into shape, working away through geological time. It's an image that might have seemed strange to Darwin, but I think he would have come to love it. Thank you very much.
Dawkins has kindly agreed to take questions. And anyone who would like to put a question, please queue up at the front of the aisles. We have microphones.
We have the lights up, the house lights up, so we can see it. Yes.
Recently, I read a book by Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind. And in the book, he says, we are descended from earlier humans whose minds help them cohere, cooperate, and outcompete. And therefore, this groupishness survives, which explains why humans throughout the world tend to form groups. Now, does this fall into the category of, as you mentioned in your talk, group selection nonsense?
Darwin himself is the only place where Darwin himself is tempted by the group selection error, and it occurs in The Descent of Man, and he does indeed fall into that trap. Groupishness need mean only a tendency to live in groups and flourish in groups and thrive in groups. Now, lots of animals thrive in groups. Birds flock, fish school. In all sorts of ways, animals benefit by living in groups for all kinds of reasons. And in the case of birds flocking, it probably helps them to avoid predation, and with the kind of safety in numbers effect. Penguins huddle together for warmth. There are all sorts of reasons why living in groups is a good thing to do. But that's extremely different from group selection, where you're talking about different groups surviving better than other groups. And that's what one means by group selection, and that is indeed what Darwin himself meant when he discussed this in The Descent of Man. But I would not call it group selection unless I was very satisfied that there really was an effect whereby different groups survive better than others, and groups have to be, as I would put it, vehicles for genes that are better at passing on genes than other groups. And it's very hard to make the case that groups of any animal, humans are no exception, have that property. Now, it is true that certain social, cultural properties of human groups, and this is what Darwin is kind of talking about, may make those groups better at surviving than others. For example, a group that has, say, a very warlike god, that worships a very warlike god, as Muslims do, might prevail in war, as indeed the Muslims did, over groups that have a pacific god. But I wouldn't call that group selection. I would call that's more analogous to ecological succession. That's more analogous to the way that the grey squirrel, when introduced foolishly by the Duke of Bedford into England, spread and completely destroyed the red squirrel. That's ecological succession. One species is better equipped than the other to survive, and it does so. That's not group selection. To call it group selection is misleading. We sorted out the group selection problem years ago. Let's stick with that and don't raise caste issues that don't help and only confuse. I wasn't suggesting so that you were doing that.
You mentioned random evolution and just like a random walk. Could you comment on that, genetic therapy and eugenics?
Oh, well, genetic therapy and eugenics is a very different matter from random. So I don't know which one you want to talk about. I was talking about genetic drift and, in its modern form, the neutral theory of evolution. If you actually sample the gene frequencies over generations, and when you discover change, when you discover fixation at one locus, when you discover that a mutation that starts out rare eventually ends up common at its own locus, that is evolution. And one reason why that might happen is selection. That's the interesting reason. But there's a less interesting reason, which is random drift, the neutral theory. You couldn't get it by random walk. I could go into it if necessary, but we've got more questions to come, I suspect. So that's random evolution. Then you ask about gene therapy and eugenics. Well, this is certainly not random. This is directed by humans, and whereas natural selection is directed not by humans but by survival and success in reproduction, gene therapy and eugenics are directed by humans. Gene therapy would be engineered mutation, taking control of the mutation part of the Darwinian equation and manipulating it to human advantage, or what's perceived to be human advantage. Eugenics would be taking the selection part of the Darwinian equation and artificially selecting humans for what might be perceived as advantage. I have no doubt that eugenics would work if people had the will to do it. I have no doubt that you could breed, if you wanted to, say, win the high jump at the Olympics in 1,000 years' time, you could achieve it by some sophisticated version mating male high jumpers to female high jumpers. Negative, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing, and I'm not advocating that. It's extremely unfashionable, to say the least, to advocate. It's an interesting fact, actually, that while humans have been doing that to domestic animals for millennia, and domestic plants, we don't seem to have done it to ourselves, which is a slightly odd fact. Cows with milk yield so great that they can scarcely walk. We race horses who can run fast and also break their legs with alarming frequency. We breed chickens that are continuous egg layers. We breed pigs that couldn't survive in the wild. We breed wolves that have become Pekingeses and Yorkshire Terriers. And we could have done that to humans, and we haven't. And maybe that's rather encouraging. People who have problems with what's called positive eugenics, the sort of thing Hitler tried to do, breeding tall, blonde, blue-eyed. Okay, but never mind. People who object to positive eugenics, many people don't object to negative eugenics, that's to say, trying to eliminate hereditary diseases. If you could, for example, using in vitro fertilization, where you take eggs from a woman and fertilize them outside the woman, and then let the embryo grow to, say, an 8-cell stage in a Petri dish under a microscope. You can then, before implanting it back into the woman, you can extract one cell from the 8 and look at its genes. Modern genetic analysis is so fine that you could actually do that. Now, if the parents have a dangerous hereditary condition, like haemophilia or one of those Huntington's chorea or something like that, you know that in the case of Huntington's chorea, there's a 50% chance that the embryo, 50% of the embryos that you get from one couple will have the lethal gene. So you extract one cell, examine its DNA, and if it's got the lethal gene, don't put that one back. Pick one that doesn't have a lethal gene. And that's a beautiful, brilliant way of eliminating these terrible hereditary diseases. Some people even have moral objections to doing that, and I certainly don't. That's enough on that question.
Professor, thank you very much for your talk. I'd like to hear your opinion on complexity theory, especially as developed by Stuart Kauffman, and whether or not you think that emergence or spontaneous order has a place, not to supplant natural selection, but maybe to have a synergistic relationship with it.
And when you said, you didn't say debunked by Stuart Kauffman, you said developed by Stuart Kauffman. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Yes. It is true that when we talk about natural selection, choosing for survival those phenotypes that are best at surviving because they've got the right genes, one could have a sort of spectrum of ideas from each gene just having a tiny little effect upon the length of the horns or the ears or the number of hairs on the toes or something of that sort, or the length of the legs or the colour of the hair. And that certainly happens, and that's one important way in which mutation causes change, which is then subject to selection. But it's also possible to imagine that mutation might have a much more complex effect, that mutation might cause a change in embryonic development so large that the resulting change in phenotype is not just a tiny quantitative shift, but a major complex change. I call this kaleidoscopic embryology, because when you tap a kaleidoscope, you move from one beautiful symmetric form to another at random. But because of the mirrors in the kaleidoscope, it's very elegant. Now, I suspect that probably does happen, and that the range of phenotype that is offered up for selection by mutation may indeed include great changes of a complex nature. What you mustn't do is ever suggest that spontaneous arising of complexity could produce a complex, functioning, adaptive organ such as an eye. It would be tempting to run with a kind of extreme version of complexity theory that said, in a single step, you could have a mutation that causes an eye to develop, complete with a lens, retina, stopping down mechanism, focusing mechanism, and so on. That will not happen, because that's change in an adaptive direction. And the only way you can get change in an adaptive direction is by selection. Yes, things like the first segmented animal, that might have been a single mutation, or the first five-pointed starfish or something of that sort. I could just about imagine that. But you would never get the illusion of design. You would never get the production of something that an engineer would admire as being well designed, but in a single mutation instead.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I want to interrupt the flow of questions for just 1 minute to let everyone know what the plan is. We do need to vacate this hall by about 5:40. We'll take as many questions as we can, but after that, Professor Dawkins will be signing books in 1920 Buchanan. No personalization and no photos, but Professor Dawkins has graciously agreed to sign the books. Okay, thank you very much.
Could you comment on the evolutionary significance of a sense of appreciation of beauty and of nature in humankind or other animals?
I'm conscious of being in the world centre of evolutionary psychology, and the room is probably filled with people far better qualified to answer that kind of question than I am. But I'll soldier on and do my best. There have been adaptive suggestions for why we appreciate beauty. For example, Gordon Oriens has suggested that we find certain landscapes beautiful, and we make gardens to resemble those beautiful landscapes because they would have signified a suitable environment for our ancestors to live in. In the case of beauty of each other, of other people, then sexual beauty of a sexual partner is obviously to be understood in evolutionary terms. We do need, because we're sexually reproducing, we need to choose certain partners, and it makes entire sense that certain characteristics would be more desirable than others, and these might feed into that which we consider beautiful. When you think about more artificial kinds of beauty, as in the beauty of music, say, then it becomes a bit more tricky. Music and poetry and philosophy and mathematics are all products of our large brain filtered through the very complicated process of cultural evolution, which resembles biological evolution but is very different and doesn't depend on genetic change. So something like beauty of music has to be understood at a more kind of indirect level. one suggestion that's been made by Steven Pinker is that we appreciate music because it's, I think he calls it the cheesecake theory. It's a supernormal stimulus. Cheesecake is, or sugar, say, are stimuli which the ancestral equivalent of sugar or fat would have been very attractive to our ancestors because we couldn't get enough of it, and nowadays we can get too much of it, but it is nevertheless very attractive. Pinker calls music, I think it's auditory cheesecake. And we needed to have, in order to process the sounds coming into our brains, perhaps particularly for speech, we needed to have frequency analyzing mechanisms that were capable of very finely judging frequencies and harmonics, octaves and fifths and fourths and thirds and so on, because you need that in order to sort out the jumble of noise, which is speech and other kinds of noise as well. I think that you have frequency analyzing mechanisms in your nervous system. Pure tones or chords or violins or clarinets or trumpets would be supernormal stimuli for the frequency analyzing mechanisms. And I guess you can make a similar case for rhythms. So I'm out of my field here. There are others better qualified than I am.
Thanks again so much. Just wanted to get your opinion on Monsanto's genetically modified foods, the way in which it was passed through the FDA and its possible ecological effects and the effects on humans.
This, I gather, is this a current political data in this country?
Monsanto dominates the food system with roughly 90% of genetically modified foods.
Right, and am I right that that's the company that yeah, I don't think I'd better I just don't know enough about it. I'm vaguely aware. I'm vaguely aware that they're widely regarded as bad guys, but I think it would be unwise of me to comment given that I actually know nothing about it. Oh, well, okay, since I let you down on the first one.
It's just a thought that I have. Based on the fact that humans have no natural predators other than humans themselves, and sometimes desirable traits are not what lead to reproduction, can we reconcile that theory that with natural selection, or incorporate it perhaps, that maybe security is a desirable trait, or I don't know. Do you understand the basis of my question, sir?
Not really, no.
So it's possible that somebody with a desirable trait may be passed over for reproduction by somebody who has undesirable traits but can support themselves financially.
Oh.
So is that
I think a lot hinges on what you mean by desirable. I mean, what you might mean by desirable is the kind of trait which would have survived in nature, like being able to run fast and have keen eyesight and things. Whereas now we are cushioned from natural selection, and it's not that it's not easy to die young nowadays. So there isn't the usual selection in favour of being swift of limb and keen of eye and those sorts of things. There doubtless is natural selection going on, but it probably isn't in favour of traits which you might consider desirable. I'm not sure it's in favour of things like making money. I mean that would have been the case in our ancestors, perhaps, where accumulating wealth in a polygamous society might have translated itself into being able to buy wives, and therefore buy lots of opportunities for reproduction of your genes, along the lines of Muley Ishmael the Bloodthirsty, who had, I think, more than 800 children. And he got his name for bloodthirsty from his habit of mounting his horse, which was to leap into the saddle, drawing his sword, and cutting off the head of the slave who held the bridle as he did so. So it was a quick release mechanism for the horse to take off. That was the kind of characteristic that might have been favoured. as being desirable in a sort of world where Muley Ishmael was the ruler. I don't know why I told that story.
Very much appreciated. Thank you. Thank you for your talk. My question is, generally speaking, what is it that determines the survival and longevity of a species? So compare the dodo bird, which is around a very short amount of time, compared to a cockroach, which was around, forever. Kind of generally speaking, why does one species go extinct so much quicker than another?
Yes, good question. The first thing to make absolutely clear is that that's nothing to do with natural selection. Selection doesn't choose between species, and that is a very common misconception, which I'm sure you have heard. But it's true that some species are more likely to go extinct than others, and I suppose it's just very different in every case. You can, to some extent, generalize. You can say that when times get tough, species that have evolved towards extreme specialization can only do one thing, are likely to be vulnerable to extinction. Something like, koala bears, which live in the Australian eucalyptus forest, can only eat eucalyptus leaves, whereas something like a rat or a cockroach will eat anything. And so it's a reasonable bet that when the next catastrophe happens, whether it's a man-made catastrophe or a meteorite hitting the United States or something, that the species that are rather few species that are likely to survive and not go extinct would tend to be things like rats or cockroaches that can eat anything that can survive in a wide variety of conditions. I think it's probably fair to say that as species grow larger and larger in evolution, they become more vulnerable to extinction. But I think really you probably have to answer that question on a case-by-case basis.
I wanted to know more about Lamarck's contributions. People often describe epigenetics or cultural evolution as Lamarckian, in that they'll take place over the course of over the lifetime of a single individual. They'll have effects on that level. I just wonder how much you can give him credit for.
Lamarck predated Darwin, and he believed in it of a sort. It was a rather odd sort. He thought of species as turning into other species, but he thought of them as kind of modern species turning into other modern species. He thought that the driving force of evolution was, really desire. It was really a sort of the animal had an urge. Proverbially, he talked about giraffes stretching their necks, to try to get higher and higher towards the leaves, and the stretching of the neck, the urging onwards, the stretching of the neck caused the neck to become a bit longer, and then, or another example would be, a favourite example is the blacksmith's arms. The blacksmith constantly hammering and lifting things develops very strong arm muscles. This is what Lamarck called the principle of use and disuse. The more you use a bit of yourself, the more it grows, the bigger it gets. Muscles that you use get bigger, and so on. That was the principle of use and disuse, and then finally the principle of inheritance of acquired characteristics. Something like the blacksmith's muscles got passed on to the blacksmith's son. Something got into the germs, got into the gene, into the germline, into the genes. And it was the inheritance of acquired characteristics coupled with the principle of use and disuse that led to the evolution of adaptation. You could just about imagine that working for something like the blacksmith's arms. You could just about imagine it working where bits of you that you use a lot do indeed get bigger. But I think it's wrong to suggest that Lamarckian evolution is a perfectly viable theory if only the facts supported inheritance of acquired characteristics. I think it was Ernst Mayr, the great German-American evolutionist, who said that there's nothing wrong with the Lamarckian theory, just that acquired characteristics are not inherited. I think there is something wrong with it. I think that even if acquired characteristics were inherited, it still isn't anything like a big enough theory, a powerful enough theory, to account for adaptation as we see it. Once you've gone beyond the blacksmith's arms, imagine something like the evolution of the eye. Once again, complicated mechanism. In the case of vertebrates, it works like a camera, focusable lens, stopping down the mechanism, 3 color-coded photocells at the back, correction for aberration, all sorts of things. That's not going to get better. That's not going to come about through the principle of use and disuse. You don't. It's not the case that the more light streams through a lens, the better it gets at being a lens. And if you think of almost any adaptation you like, apart from blacksmith's arms, almost any adaptation you like, it's not going to get better just from being used. On the contrary, it's probably going to get worse because it wears out. The beauty of Darwinian natural selection is that no matter how obscurely and deeply buried within the body the thing is, the tiniest of biochemical adaptations that never sees the light of day, it's all inside the pancreas or something, if it has any contribution, the mutation has any contribution whatsoever to increasing the survival chances of the animal, natural selection will pick it up and run with it. And so natural selection can explain adaptation of any sort, any kind of improvement natural selection can do, whereas Lamarckian evolution, even if acquired characteristics were inherited, can only work to produce crude things like the blacksmith's arms. Now you mentioned cultural evolution and suggested that this was Lamarckian. I don't think it's very helpful to call it Lamarckian, although people often have. It's been called Lamarckian in the sense that acquired knowledge, say, is inherited. I mean, you learn something and you pass it on. To that extent, I suppose it's Lamarckian. But the improvement that comes about in technology, say, or whatever it is you're talking about, that seems to me is kind of quasi-Darwinian. I mean, the reason why certain inventions do get passed on is because they're better inventions, they're good. Even when the engineer is working on his drawing board, designing something, he keeps on designing things and screwing up the paper and tossing it in the waste paper basket and trying again. There's a kind of Darwinian flavour to even cultural evolution, I think. I'm rather inclined to the view of the great American evolutionist George C. Williams, who said what at first sight sounds rather that mutation rates, to the extent that they are changed by natural selection, they tend to zero. Mutation rates actually are controlled by natural selection. Like everything else about the body, the mutation rate in a particular locus is under genetic control, and so it would be theoretically possible for natural selection to favour an increase in mutation rates. And you might think that would be a good idea, because evolution, after all, does need mutation. So, and it is indeed known that there are genes called mutator genes, whose phenotypic effect is not to increase the length of the arm or something, but to increase the mutation rate. So the way in which natural selection might increase mutation rate would be to favour a mutator gene. Now, just think what's going to happen. Suppose a mutator gene arises which causes an increase in the mutation rate in the body in which it sits. The great majority of mutations are bad. The great majority of mutations are disadvantageous for pretty obvious reasons. It's a random change. How could a random change in any complicated mechanism? It's not likely to be an improvement. So most mutations are bad. A mutator gene, which causes an increase in the mutation rate, will find itself in the next generation sitting in the body of a freak. It may cause one or two good mutational changes, but it will cause a whole lot more bad ones. So Williams's point is that natural selection will always penalize mutator genes, and at least under normal conditions. So that raises the question, well, why do we have any mutations at all? And that's because nothing's perfect. DNA replication is an extremely high fidelity process, but like any other copying process, it's not quite perfect. I think sort of the laws of physics really determine that. So mutation, it's extremely good that we have mutation, because otherwise evolution wouldn't be possible. But nevertheless, natural selection penalizes mutation. That's the Williams view, and it sounds persuasive to me. There may be some special circumstances in which mutation rates are raised. I think
this will have to be the last question.
For simpler organisms, it's very easy to see the effects of genes on behavior, such as a protein that binds a chemical and then drives motility towards that chemical. But when you move to a more complex organism like a human being, I was wondering, and you have to deal with epigenetics and all these sorts of other means of gene expression, how genes actually affect human behavior, and whether, based on that, you can still apply the traditional natural selection in the traditional sense.
Mutation would work via the processes of embryonic development. And the processes of embryonic development in a creature like that, as you say, can be very complicated, are very complicated. And so it may well be that we don't, indeed in most cases, we don't understand exactly what's going on when a mutation causes a change in the phenotype, causes a change in embryonic development, which you observe a change in the phenotype. You can, however, from an evolutionary point of view, treat the entire embryonic process as a black box. You don't actually need to know any embryology at all in order to do genetics. All you need to do is to do pedigree work, is to cross animals, whatever they are, and observe that certain characteristics are, as a matter of fact, inherited. And that you can do, and people do it, and it's been done for a very long time. And long before we had any idea of how genes actually do influence embryos, it was possible to not only work out, well, we could even work out the order in which genes were strung along chromosomes. This was done in Drosophila by T.H. Morgan and Sturtevant and people like that. Treating embryology as a black box. So from an evolution point of view, it would be very nice if we understood how genes affect phenotypes, and it's a very good thing that embryologists are working on it. But we don't have to give up just because we don't yet know the embryonic details. Thank you very much.
Thank you.